my story is not the most traditional one, but if somebody like me can go from being a Satanist, leftist, to being a Christian conservative, we can get anybody.
What is going on, everyone, and welcome to another Coffee Table Talks. I have an extraordinary guest sitting across from me with an amazing perspective that we need to dive into. But first, I want to start off things a little bit differently. Listen, I want you to like, subscribe, comment, and do all the stuff. I want to get that out of the way at the forefront. We are trying to push ourselves into the algorithm, and that's on you guys. You guys make that happen. You are our family. You are sitting here at the coffee table just as much as my guest is right across from me. And speaking of my guest, Alexander, my man, can you introduce yourself?
I can indeed. So my name is Alexander Warren, and a little bit about me is that up until recently, this year in fact, I was a wokeist, I was a Satanist, and I was a Democrat. So I was a California poster boy, essentially. Could slap me up on the flyer, tourist, whatever. And recently, I found God, and I found the Conservative Party. And, the strength of ideals that they have, and the honor and dignity that they possess, as opposed to what my former life was like.
Well, dude, I'll tell you, it's funny, man. You say that you're a California man, right? Where's that California surfer boy attitude, my guy? You've got the hair for it.
I was born in Georgia, so fortunately I'm not all the way Californian. My heart goes out to them. But I'm a Georgian boy, born and raised. I was born in Warner Robins, Georgia, down south. I grew up in the Cartersville area most of my life. I moved into Alpharetta, and that's sort of when the problems began in high school, really. That's when everything went awry.
Well, we talked, Alexander, we talked a little bit about this, man. We talked a little bit about this prior. It was the three cracks that really got at you, man. And I kind of want to... I want to start us down that road. I do. I want to start us down that road because I want to get into this conversation. What was the first crack that you think set you on this path?
The first crack for me definitely was BLM. So that happened, George Floyd died, and you had a rise in peaceful protests, right? You had people, marching down the streets, and at the time, I was pretty far left. I was a strong blue Democrat, whole 9 yards, and I did the mandatory black square on Instagram. I'm doing my part, and shortly after that, you saw the protest turn violent, and at that moment, I didn't really shift in either direction. I didn't go more left or more right. But at that moment, it sort of was the catalyst. It was the match to the dynamite, as it was, where it made me very, very skeptical of things. Things weren't as all as the bill of goods that they had sold me.
Well, dude, one of the things that I find fascinating is, especially, given my, the saturation that I have in college, right? So I see a lot of these young kids interact with each other. And for that matter, I see a lot of these younger kids socially distance themselves from one another once they start to go against the dynamic. They start to go against the flow. Did you have a moment like that? Was there ever a moment where you posted something online or you said something in a chat where you're like, guys, I kind of don't think this BLM thing is kosher. I don't think it's good that they're doing all of this. Was there any kind of kickback?
Yes and no. So I was in the theater department. So in case anybody at home doesn't know, theater departments usually run pretty left, just by a factor of Broadway and, the whole New York ecosystem of the fine arts. So, I definitely mentioned a few times, like, hey, violent protests aren't a good thing, because the entire movement, and, was basically these communities are disadvantaged. We should build up these communities, we should protect these communities, and, so on and so forth. It's hard to do that when they're all on fire. And I was very like, hey, look, I agree with you. We should build up these communities. But burning them down does more harm than good. And, there are definitely a few people that were like, yeah, I could see that. But the majority of them, kind of trotted out the same old talking points of like, oh, riots are just the language of the unheard. And, I think there is an element of truth to that. But the concern for me specifically was the coverage it got. Nobody was talking about how it was a bad thing, right? Nobody was talking about how they supported peaceful protests but condoned, the violence and, terror that was going on. People were, dying, their livelihoods were being burned down. And, you had a man standing in front of a, burning car and was like, everything is fine. Trust me, bro. It's fine. And that was sort of the moment I became very, very skeptical and sort of realized maybe things aren't all what they tell me they are, if that makes sense.
Well, something I want to inquire about, man, is your peer group was the theater kids, right? It was the very yeah, it was the very typical like theater kid, kind of group. I get that. So what I'm curious about, and I think a lot of kids can relate to this, is what was it like, kind of having these thoughts that went against their paradigm? Were you nervous? Were you at all nervous at like talking to them and saying like, hey, like, what was your thought process going through your head about that?
I mean, I will say that friend groups can definitely be a big advantage, and they can definitely be a big curse, depending on sort of the flock you're in. And when you're in that sort of flock, and there are definitely people who shared, my idea, or at least a tidbit of that, but you didn't really see any talk about that. There was definitely this mentality of, I mean, it isn't really in terms of politics, but, toe the party line, this is a good thing. There is definitely a culture of, this is what's good, this is what's not good. If you're not in this circle, you're against us.
It sounds more like a cult to me, Alexander.
That's a excellent way to put it. It's very cult-like behavior.
Well, that leads me into asking, okay, well, we understand, man, the first crack, that like occurred, this first like question, this idea of like, perhaps this is not a good way to go about things, right? How does that lead into the second crack? What is the second crack for you that made you kind of question everything?
So BLM sort of lit the match. The fuse that, got lit and, led to sort of my awakening was COVID. And I think this is true for a lot of people. And, because at first what you saw a trotting out of 2 weeks, it'll be fine. 2 weeks, guys, it'll be 2 weeks. And 2 weeks turned into 2 years, which I'm not the greatest at math, but I'm pretty sure is longer than 2 weeks. And, I remember vividly, them saying like, oh, young people, you're not the most at risk population. You'll be fine, right? And I remember saying like, well, if that's true, why do we all have to wear masks if we're going to school? If we're not at risk, why do this whole rigmarole? And they were like, well, people could have sick grandparents and this. I'm like, well, they don't have to go to school. They have the freedom to stay at home. You had the freedom to stay at home. So then you had the COVID sort of entire lockdown, which means you had the isolation and the loneliness. And I think that especially affected a lot of young men. In my opinion, young men are very, very abandoned in this country. There's not a lot of support for them. And, speaking as a young man myself, there was nothing during COVID. It was, you're alone, suck it up, buttercup. What about the patriarchy? And it's like, that's not helpful. And, it definitely, I feel, invalidated a lot of young men and made them feel like they were worthless and they didn't matter. And I think that's why you're seeing a big rise in conservatism in the youth specifically, and 12th grade men specifically. You're seeing a large rise in conservatism in them is because the Democrats, they preach that they're the party of the youth, right? And then a large portion of the youth, half of the youth, have these issues: mental health crisis, they're lonely, they feel abandoned, men's rights. I mean, there's a lot of concerns there. And, they say, like, hey, what about these things? And they're told, oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You don't matter. To put it bluntly, I mean, the Democrats care more about if you're a trans man than you're an actual man. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. And men, they're waking up, and we're not going to be pushed around. And that was definitely a moment that I was like, okay, I'm kind of fed up with this. And the vaccine mandates too, they had a culture of, they think you could bully you into submission. And even though I was a Democrat, I was a very headstrong person, and, they're like, you have to do this. And I was like, I don't think so. I had a bit of an authority problem, when I was young. I was a bit of a rebel. Theater definitely probably contributed to that. And I was like, no, I don't think so.
Well, I want to take a quick pause on the cracks, because I think we're bringing up actually a really good point. Because you weren't necessarily, from what I understand, you weren't from the get-go, out of the womb, a leftist, Satanist, kind of person. This was something that developed in you via culture over time. This was something that was opposite from what your parental situation was. Your parental situation was by and large conservative, right?
Conservative Christian.
So I'm curious, man, let's go just for a moment, let's abandon the cracks. And I want to go to the moment where you decided, like, I am going to be this leftward guy. I'm going to exist in this leftward paradigm. Where did you depart from your parental, your parental guidance into this cultural guidance?
That's a very good question. And that's a very difficult question to answer, because there was no... It's difficult because I just kind of woke up one day and I was like, I'm a leftist. Because the way they work at you and the way they get you is that they don't, in my experience at least, and this could be, different for everybody, but in my experience, it was kind of a slow degradation of value. So, I remember when, for example, and also they get you on the morality. So, being raised in a home that, was like, morality is important. Going into the public school system in a very leftist district, they were like, they definitely promote morality. So, I remember Trump won in 2016. And halfway through 2016, I'd say, is when I started sort of becoming a leftist. Because what they did was they were like, well, Trump's a racist. He's racist. You're against racism, aren't you? And you're like, well, yeah, racism isn't bad. And they're like, well, you're anti-Trump. And, as a, I was, young at the time. I forget what exact age. But, and then going into high school and, sort of the anti-Trump sentiment is they get you on the morality. So what they do is they put forward a thing that everyone by and large can probably agree with. For example, hey, racism is bad. Majority of people you ask on the street, they'll say, yeah, that's bad. But then they slip in their sort of ideological viewpoint with that. So what they do is they say racism is bad, but because you think that, you should hate Trump. and that's how they get you. It's sort of a 1-2 punch, and that's how they got me. Is because when you're a kid, you're taught respect your teachers, listen to your teachers, listen to people in authority. They know better than you. So if everyone who's supposed to know better than you is telling you these things, and you were raised in a home to basically be like, hey, I should listen to the people who are supposed to be teaching me, you listen to them. And if they're telling you, hey, you should hate Trump, eventually you're going to hate Trump, even though you have really no idea why. You're just like, yeah, I have these opinions, but why do you have your opinions? And that's sort of the brainwashing effect of it. Is they incorporate it in with the sort of sense of like moral superiority or righteousness, and it's a very intoxicating thing.
So I want us. Okay, I'm not going to dive into that. Not yet. Not yet. That is an important piece that I think what's going to happen as we go down in this conversation, I think we'll actually kind of start uncovering some ideas about morality, right? But I don't want to go there just yet. I'm tantalizing you, viewer. I don't know if you noticed.
Watch till the end.
Yeah, right. Seriously, watch till the end. I do want to visit the third crack, though. Yeah. Now, can you give me a little bit? Because I mean, this was the last crack before things started like fumbling. The big kaboom, man. Let me hear it. What was the big final push that got you out of this ideological bubble that you were in?
It was the war in Ukraine. Wow. Which, I can feel everyone kind of prickle at that. But at this point in time, I was a Satanist. I was leaning definitely more independent, with the whole COVID thing, but I was still definitely left wing. I just moved a little bit, slight nudge. So you had the war in Ukraine, and you had the sort of Democrats at this point in time. They were just bashing Republicans daily. They were calling them white supremacists. They were calling them Nazis. They were calling them any name they could conceivably come up with under the sun. And then the war in Ukraine started. And then COVID disappeared. So that was kind of suspicious. It was like, oh, war in Ukraine. Suddenly, COVID's cured. It's a miracle.
But it's back now, right? Now that we're coming up to a presidential election. Just a little bit of conspiracy,
How ironic that this virus somehow is completely based on election cycles. Truly, scientists need to research this because some things it must be some sort of scientific breakthrough, right? But you had the war in Ukraine start, and at this point in time, I was a Satanist. I became a Satanist probably about my senior year of high school. I'd attribute that to probably COVID too, this sort of ideological go against authority and free will and stuff. And because a specific type of Satanism, which is important for the viewer to know, it wasn't religious Satanism. There are branches of Satanism that are theistic. They view Satan as a actual religious entity that exists. The sect I belonged to was a non-theistic. It was an atheistic sort of belief system that viewed Satan as sort of this ideological figure that you should look up to. Free will, freedom against tyranny, this sort of do what you want, devil may care, pardon the pun, attitude. And, I was 17, 18 at the time, and, that's very attractive to a rebellious, sort of teenager like me. But going back to the war bit, so it was an atheist, so I didn't really believe in anything. I believed in some ideological idea. Load of good that does you. And you had sort of these Democrats and be like, okay, we're going to give all these money to this country that has a neo-Nazi problem. So at that point I was like, I thought we didn't like those guys. And now we're giving them $113 billion, which could have, You know, they say that we could solve world hunger with $40 billion a year. Well, you could have solved world hunger for 3 years running. You could have housed every single homeless veteran in America. You could have done a lot of things with $113 billion. So that was definitely a, we're sending all this money. We could have used it at home to help these, these people that need help. That was definitely a thing. And then you had sort of the worry that, what if we get involved? And I'm prime draft age. I'm 21 years old, and admittedly, I'm a bit of an overthinker. I like playing chess. I always like thinking, 3 moves ahead. And there is a scenario in which things escalate, and I get drafted, and I die, to put it bluntly. And up until that point, I'd never really considered my own mortality, if that makes sense. I always, I was the type of kid that was like, oh, I'm a theater kid. I'll be dead by the time I'm 50. Doesn't matter. YOLO, right? But at that point, I was really faced with the possibility of my own death. And not for a noble cause, for a completely preventable cause. For some wannabe Napoleonic figure, to basically warmonger and try to play hero in Eastern Europe. And at that point in time, I was like, maybe they're wrong. And that's when the bubble, shattered, for lack of a better word. And, in faced with my own mortality, that's when I found faith. Because as an atheist, it was like, okay, you die, that's it. Kablooey. It's it. Finality. And that's a terrifying thought when you're considering getting drafted at 21 years old. And, I remember being like, okay, maybe I should go to church. Maybe, I should, look into this whole Christian thing. And I did. And I liked what I saw. There is a sense of community. There is a sense of family. There is a sense of actual idealism and not this sort of false hope sort of thing that they peddle on the left. And I was like, okay. And, that's when I also switched to being a conservative, because I saw these conservatives, standing up and saying the exact same things I thought. And I was like, well, if they're saying what I think, I'm probably one of them. And so I started going in that direction. And, I'm now proud to say I'm a conservative. I switched from being a Satanist to a Christian. And all that really happened within the past 5 months.
I want to paint this picture for the viewers and the listeners, because I've actually started a Spotify now. So I'm posting to 2 different types of media space. One where they just get to listen to us talk back and forth, and another one where they get to watch and listen to us talk back and forth. But something really important to paint here is these 3 cracks, and this is why I think this concept was so darn important, is because they give way. It's like, okay, crack 1, crack 2, crack 3 gives way to this false foundation that made up your life. It was this false foundation, it was this humanistic foundation, right? One based on this satanic, this idealism that you are under. And then you find yourself falling in this free fall of like, oh my gosh, what the heck's going on? And then you land on this solid foundation, which is this Christian idea, right? We're not going to get into the religious aspect of Baptist or Methodist or whatever. It is purely Christian, the idea to be what is a Christian. This is what I was talking about with morality, especially with young men, especially during COVID, right? Because they felt abandoned. You can probably talk about this a little bit, is the way that you felt during COVID, the abandonment, the loneliness, the isolation, et cetera, et cetera. These are very human-derived feelings, right? What I want you to talk about is under your Satanist idealism and your feeling of abandonment and isolation, how would you have felt during the whole COVID process if you had been a Christian during that process?
That's a darn good question. So it's important for that question to break down what Satanism is. Satanism is about the ideology of the self, right? It's about completely self-centered, and not necessarily self-centered, but it's about your own free will. It's about yourself. Fundamentally, that's what it is. There's no real sense of you should have a family or community. It's about your own free will, your own sort of path, right? Your own pathway. And that's all fine and dandy when things are going swimmingly, but when you hit a brick wall and something, like the COVID shutdowns happen, and you're alone, and you feel abandoned, and you're in this sort of wilderness, this metaphorical wilderness, when you don't have anybody to lean on, because also there is real no. At this point in time, I was also out of high school, which means all those high school friends I had, all of them were gone. So, by and large, I was truly in isolation. Versus, Christianity is a faith that's definitely based in the sense of community and family. So, I would definitely say that I'd probably have still felt the effects of that isolation. I think that's a normal thing to go through in that sort of predicament. But I think instead of being at an 11, it would have been probably a 2 or 3. And it would have definitely been a lot easier to cope with those realities that I was facing than, just being a Satanist.
Alexander, this toes in line with a concept that I've been working on for a while, which this is my personal faith journey, right? Which is the journey of the intangible, understanding the intangible idea. And I want to kind of paint the picture again, right? Is you're a young man, you're sitting at your desk. Let's say you're living in the human idea, right? The human idea of existence, and you are all alone. You've lost all of your friends. Nobody wants to come on Discord. Nobody wants to play Call of Duty. You're just sitting there in your room by yourself. That is the teetotal of your existence. How lonely is that? That's incredibly lonely and incredibly detrimental to your mind. Mm-hmm. And it's a culture that insists that is existence. Now, you take the intangible, right? You take the intangible idea. You take the idea of the Christian. And what that does to your mind, right? What that does is it frees you, right? You feel like, okay, in this current condition, I am alone. I am alone. I don't have anybody here. But I've got this intangible existence above me that is ever consistent, ever the standard, never changing, and he is just a Bible verse away, right? He's a beautiful story in the book of Job. Right, or some kind of story that exemplifies hardship. And then in those words, it's like, God speaks to you through the Bible, right? And in those words, you find yourself uplifted. You didn't have to go to your friends in high school. You didn't have to go on Discord. You didn't have to play Call of Duty. You didn't have to desperately just go out on your road and sit there and just watch people in their windows as they're watching you, being like, oh, I wonder what he's doing out there on the road during COVID. Shame on him, right? Silently judging you. The intangible standard is a reliance in something that is always going to be there when you don't have anybody there. And I think a lot of young men desperately need to understand that nowadays. They do, man. A lot of these kids that I interact with in college, a lot of these young men are lonely. Mm-hmm. They're lonely. And they don't know what to do. They live in a culture where they're too afraid to potentially even talk to women because they fear that women are going to say, horrible things about them. Mm-hmm. And their entire life is going to be ruined. See Brett Kavanaugh, who runs for office, and then out of nowhere, this allegation all of a sudden comes up, mm-hmm. right? You have influences like that on these young men, and they're just like, man, I don't even know if I want to talk to a girl or get in a relationship or something like that.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that because if you look at the actual statistics, men's sexual assault is a massive concern. Me Too movement, didn't mention it. which means if you have men that feel lost and feel invalidated, you have a lot of women who are saying like, well, me too and this and that, but you're not doing that for men who are sexually assaulted, who are abused both emotionally, physically. Is you have a lot of men who are all live in fear of being like, oh, what if? But also you have a lot of men who, if that happens to them, there's no support, which means they feel even more lost. And this is why you see that the male's suicide rate is 4 times that of women. It's because there's no network, there's no support, there's no help, and men just feel lost. You're seeing a lost generation of men right now.
Alexander, I want to end this on one last question.
Yeah.
And this is going to be a pretty real question, man. How did the Christian conservative fail you? How did we fail you? How did we let you go? How did we let you slip through our fingers and lose yourself to this Satanist, this leftist ideology?
For me, that's a twofold answer. One, I think it's important to recognize that it's not all the conservative or Christian's fault. Is that you saw with Twitter, they censor conservative voices, right? They suppress them. You're not recommended them. You don't see them. Same thing with Christianity, is that there is a deliberate suppression of those ideas in the mainstream media and social media, which means it's not by and large totally their fault. You have to recognize that there are suppression, tactics out there. That being said, and I'll answer both this in terms of the conservative aspect and the Christian aspect. And, they're definitely linked, but it was 2 different things for me. So we'll start with the Christian. For me, church was a very boring place you go to. It's dodgy. You stand up, you sing your hymns, you sit down, then you listen to a guy talk for about an hour about whatever, and then you go home. And that doesn't appeal. Or televangelists, right, on cable news. So I think the issue facing Christianity now is that a lot of these Christian leaders are older. And that's not me saying, oh, that's bad. It's just that there is a lack of our generation as Christian leaders. There's a lack of including our voices, I think. And I think that's the same problem with the Conservative Party is, for example, I'm 21. You can't name me like a 30-year-old televangelist off the top of your head, but I guarantee you probably know, Joel Osteen and, whatever televangelist, I was a Joel Osteen growing up. So, there's no Joel Osteen of my generation. And I think with YouTube and, Twitch and all these social media platforms is that churches have an excellent opportunity sort of modernize their outreach and reach. I mean, what's the statistic? How many people have access to the internet? 4-point-something billion people. And, one of the things in the Bible, it was, God said, take my word to, everyone in this world. And the internet offers a perfect opportunity for that. And I think that's definitely an underutilized thing for the Christian church. And for the conservatives, it's a lack of messaging. It's my generation has definitely different concerns than conservatives did 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. And a lot of the concerns we express, like, hey, student loans, for example. I disagree with forgiveness for student loans, right? That being said, the conversation of, hey, what about student loans is immediately, nah, we're not going to talk about that. And I think, there are conservative solutions to that issue. Whether, that's saying like, hey, for example, university president, you're in service of education. Maybe you don't need a $2 million salary. Maybe there's some cost-cutting regulation we can do there. Or, maybe it's prioritizing apprenticeship programs and maybe a sort of getting people into different avenues other than just, your 2-year and 4-year degree. And I think there are conservative solutions. The issue is that the Conservative Party today, their solution to sort of the youth issues or any Democrat, like for example, Democrat puts forward an issue, is that their solution is, no, we're not going to talk about that because that's a leftist issue, and then they don't mention it. Versus if they actually went, okay, that is an issue young people care about. Let us have a conversation about this, because maybe there's maybe a middle ground, or maybe there's a conservative solution to this issue. And I think there are a lot of conservative solutions to issues that the youth is facing. But if there's no conversation, there's no involvement, is that youth are going to go to the only party that listens to them, or acts like they listen to them, which I don't think they really... they use us as pawns. The Democrat Party uses the youth as pawns. And I think if the Conservative Party pulled up their bootstraps, because we love that analogy, and said, okay, let us have a conversation about these issues that the youth are facing, you're going to see a massive wave of youth support for Republicans, which is more important than ever.
Well, Alexander, man, before we depart, 2 things. One is a warning. Is as you walk now in your Christian faith, right? And again, this is beyond religious institution. This is purely your walk with Christ. Be careful. Don't get too overzealous, man. Don't get too enthralled. It's exciting, and it is so exciting to find yourself in this faith, right? Don't let it overtake you to the point that it overshadows Christ's work on another person that you might be talking with. You know what I mean? Let Christ work through you. Exactly, man. Exemplify. It's the idea of bringing someone into your dinner table or coffee table and sitting down and just offering them a cup of coffee and then pouring it for them. It's stuff like that, right?
Or having a gift. So this is a daily devotional by David Teams. It's called Godspeed. And I still exemplify classic conservative Christian values of, somebody invites you into your home and onto this excellent podcast, which it was an honor. You bring them something.
Oh, man, thank you. Godspeed. Voices of the Reformation. Wow, dude, clarity is expensive. Ain't that the truth? Well, you're not going out empty-handed either. You're getting my ego on a cup, as I call it. My face on a mug there, right? It is a quid pro quo. Alexander, you are probably going to continue to be a wealth of information as time goes on. I think this was a very good preliminary dive into your journey. And it's going to be fascinating to see where you go from here, man. I got to say, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
My one thing when I came onto this podcast was, I get to be on a podcast, but also, if my story is not the most traditional one, but if somebody like me can go from being a Satanist, leftist, to being a Christian conservative, we can get anybody. And I think there's a lot of hope there. I think there is a lot of hope there. And I think a lot of people are worried and a lot of people are scared. But I think it's important to recognize that if someone like me can come around, anyone else can too.
Well, heck yeah. Well, buddy, cheers. Thank you for coming on, brother.